I realized something was wrong the moment I noticed a parade of neon pink beach chairs marching down my driveway. Their owners, mostly folks I'd never seen before, moved with a cheerful determination that froze me in place. My home is nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the only excitement usually comes from who forgot to bring in their garbage bins or who snagged the best deal on mulch. Yet here they were, complete strangers, setting up for what appeared to be a massive backyard jamboree. And all signs, unfortunately, pointed toward my pool. My name is Angela Beaumont. I moved here not too long ago, thinking I'd found the perfect space to enjoy a peaceful existence away from the daily grind. Sure, there was a homeowners association. Most of these communities have them, but I wasn't too worried. I'd read the bylaws and thought I could abide by the usual trim your hedges, keep your trash cans hidden, and don't paint your house neon orange. Still, something about the fresh stack of HOA notices in my mailbox should have tipped me off. You see, the new president of our HOA, Mrs. Hurst, has grand ideas for community building. She's a short, feisty woman whose favorite pastime seems to be enumerating rules in a shrill voice. Last week, she left a message on my voicemail about revisiting communal property guidelines that might affect my backyard. It was easy to disregard. The documents I signed when I bought the house were perfectly clear. My yard was my yard. My pool was my pool. I paid for the design, the maintenance, the unexpected repairs. There was zero reason to suspect that the HOA or anyone else could claim it. But reality had come marching in. Over a dozen families were busy hauling coolers, umbrellas, and inflatable swans into my backyard. A man in a sun visor was swatting at my prized jasmine vines to make space for a big sound system, while a couple of teenagers were fiddling with a portable grill only a few yards from my rose bed. My rose bed. The nerve. I made a beeline for the front of the house, scanning for anyone official looking. That's where I spotted Mrs. Hurst, perched near my mailbox with a binder in her arms like she was presiding over a court hearing. Her smile was uncomfortably wide, and she gave a little wave when she saw me striding up. "Angela, dear, so glad you're here," she called, as though this was all a quaint, friendly matter. "We've decided to make your pool the central gathering spot this weekend. Isn't that marvelous?" "What?" I sputtered, my voice caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. "Who exactly gave you permission to host a party in my backyard?" Her expression hardened so fast, it was as if she'd flipped a switch. "You see, there's a small clause in our community guidelines that states certain amenities can be deemed public if they significantly overlap with designated common areas. Our board had a meeting," she patted her binder. "We voted. Your swimming pool now counts as a shared facility for the neighborhood." I felt a flush rise from my neck to my face, my heart pounding in my ears. "That's impossible. The property lines are right there. My fence isn't even attached to the community's perimeter fence." Mrs. Hurst gave a condescending shrug. "The consensus is that the fence could be misleading, and you have an entrance from the side that opens directly onto the community path. That's why the board determined it's effectively common property. We've already posted about it on our community forum. Everyone's extremely excited." I glanced over her shoulder to see more bodies making their way across my lawn. My dog, Pee-wee, a boisterous Labrador, barked frantically from behind the glass door. He wasn't used to this many visitors. Neither was I. But from the looks of it, my yard was about to fill to capacity. I clenched my teeth, refusing to let panic take over. "This is not acceptable," I said. "Whatever you think you've decided, I don't consent. I have the paperwork to prove my property boundaries." "That's your choice to dispute, of course," she said, an oily smugness in her tone. "But for now, the HOA is moving forward. We have liability waivers. People just want to celebrate the start of summer. You wouldn't want the entire neighborhood thinking you're petty, now, would you?" Before I could retort, she brushed past me, trailing her signature perfume, the stench of arrogance. She hopped onto my porch and began greeting newcomers as though she owned the place. My fists clenched as I watched the scene. Children piling into the pool, inflatable rings floating about, laughing couples testing the diving board. Uninvited, unapproved, and unbelievably brazen. Bottling up my anger wasn't healthy. But the last thing I wanted was to scream in front of neighbors I barely knew. I stormed back inside and pressed my forehead against the cool wall, forcing myself to breathe. The funny thing is, they had no idea who I was. Around here, I'm just Angela, the quiet lady who moved in with her Labrador and her carefully nurtured flowers. Nobody cares to ask about my job or my credentials. If they did, they'd discover I am, in fact, the official water commissioner for the entire state. My position puts me in charge of everything from drought management to water code compliance. But I rarely lead with that fact. People tend to morph the moment they hear the word commissioner, looking at you as either a big bureaucrat or some puffed-up politician. I always try to separate my work from my personal life. To me, it's easier to be just Angela, at home, free from the entanglements of legislation and debates. Yet as I gazed out at the circus unfolding behind my house, I realized these neighbors, this HOA, were about to push me into a corner. My meticulously maintained pool was now littered with loud strangers, thrashing kids, and enough plastic floaties to fill an entire carnival. They declared war on my property rights, all for their so-called community spirit. Little did they know they were messing with the wrong woman. I didn't want to pull rank. But if these folks truly believed they could steal my pool for their own agenda, then it was time for a wake-up call. I grabbed my phone, snapped a few photos of the encroachment, and composed myself. Let them enjoy their day for now. Because once I brought my professional might to bear on the situation, I suspected they'd wish they'd never set foot on my property. And that was just the beginning of the storm brewing behind my eyes. Early the next morning, a dozen sets of footprints trampled across the dew-soaked grass in my backyard. The party wasn't a one-day fling. Apparently, the HOA had scheduled a recurring weekend pool club. My yard, once a sanctuary of solitude, now transformed into a carnival. I stepped onto my back porch and counted at least 20 people setting up gear. And it was barely 8 a.m. A few of them had the decency to give me an awkward nod, but I saw zero remorse. A couple stood by my pool pump, which I'd meticulously installed and tuned for minimal energy usage. They turned valves and dials like they were operating a cheap carnival ride, oblivious to how crucial it was to handle the machinery carefully. If they broke it, who would be stuck with the bill? Me. I made a quick attempt at polite conversation with an older gentleman in swim trunks who was fiddling with my garden hose. "Sir, that's not a communal hose," I said firmly. "I'd really appreciate if you'd ask before using my personal equipment." He blinked at me, the soft flesh around his eyes crinkling in confusion. "Sorry, Ms. Beaumont. The group said it was okay," he replied. "Mrs. Hurst insisted we had access to everything back here." "She's wrong," I snapped, frustration flaring. "She doesn't have the authority to declare my equipment communal property. This is private land." He shrugged and set the hose down, muttering something about petty owners under his breath. My shoulders tensed. If anyone was petty, it was an HOA that let people treat a neighbor's yard like the community water park. Just then, Mrs. Hurst showed up in a wide-brimmed hat and a brand-new binder, presumably stuffed with more fictitious rules. She was in full hostess mode, directing volunteers to set up a snack table near my flower beds. I watched one of them drag a flimsy plastic table across my carefully trimmed grass, flattening a patch of lilies. "Excuse me, we need to talk," I said, marching over to her. "Your party guests are messing with my pump and trampling my flowers. This needs to stop, or they need to pay for damage." She flipped open her binder and thrust a laminated page at me. "It's all right here. According to our revised guidelines, the upkeep of anything in the designated common area is the responsibility of both the HOA and the homeowner. But as you can see, by majority vote, your pool and everything in its vicinity now constitutes part of that area." I glanced at the text. It was full of legalese that sounded impressive, but lacked actual legal foundation. In fact, I recognized some language from water policy that had been blatantly twisted to serve her argument. My temperature rose. They were using half-baked references to public water resource and communal usage out of context, trying to strong-arm me with jargon they didn't understand. That's precisely the kind of nonsense I battle in my work life. I pointed at a random phrase on the page. This clause about underground water rights has nothing to do with a privately installed swimming pool. You do realize that, don't you? She gave me a patronizing smile. I realized that change is uncomfortable, but the HOA has the best interest of the entire community at heart, and we strongly suggest you comply. The board has already set up a membership schedule. Families will come in shifts to keep it fair. Fair. I repeated under my breath, the word sour. I'll be contacting my attorney about this. Without waiting for her response, I stormed back inside. My hands shook, half with fury, half with a strange exhilaration. Part of me wanted to yank out my credentials as the state water commissioner right then and there. But I still clung to the naive hope that a civil resolution was possible. Maybe a strongly worded letter or a legal notice would scare them off. However, by midday, it was clear the HOA was doubling down. Wave after wave of neighbors appeared, some even bringing kids from outside our subdivision. The pool deck was lined with folding chairs. The air smelled of sunscreen, hot dogs, and unstoppable chaos. A few folks tried to be polite, but I caught more than a handful giving me judgmental stares, as though I was some stingy gatekeeper who wanted to deprive children of summer fun. Then came the final straw. A group of boisterous college-age partiers, relatives of an HOA board member, apparently, showed up to crash the community pool. They blasted loud music with heavy bass, filling my once tranquil yard with a rattling thump of party tracks. Pee-wee, my Labrador, whined and hid inside, unsettled by the noise and crowd. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with text messages from curious neighbors. "Hey Angie, is everything okay?" The HOA posted about the new community pool. "Didn't realize they could do that. I saw you storm off earlier. Wanting to bring over some brownies as a peace offering? LOL. Is your pool safe for such a big crowd?" I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm the storm in my chest. It wasn't just about my privacy anymore. I was actually concerned for the safety of these people, messing around in an overcrowded pool with no lifeguard or official oversight. If anything went wrong, a child scraped their knee, or an intoxicated young adult slipped on the diving board, liability would land in my lap. And the water usage, dear Lord. They were draining my precious resource for the entire weekend, playing with hoses, leaving faucets on, and generally squandering water like it was infinite. By sundown, the place looked like a disaster zone. Cups floating in the water, wrappers scattered across the grass. My carefully cultivated plants were trashed, and the deck was littered with wet towels. Everyone who left wore a grin, no doubt proud of a fantastic day spent at the community pool. Mrs. Hurst, always the last to depart, made her way to me. "We'll have our big event next Saturday," she declared, as if this was a done deal. "We're expecting nearly 100 people to celebrate the holiday. Can't wait to see you there. Don't forget to tidy up before they arrive," she added with a saccharine smile. Then she pranced off into the twilight. I watched her go, stunned and angry. 100 people? Next weekend? In my yard? This madness wouldn't be resolved with a few polite letters. I realized it was time to drop my quiet facade and set the record straight. They had no idea the can of worms they'd opened by trampling on my personal property and on the laws protecting it. The state water commissioner side of me was done playing nice. The following week, as soon as my schedule allowed, I arranged a meeting with my attorney, Mr. Khan. A tall, soft-spoken man with an encyclopedic knowledge of property law, he raised his eyebrows higher with every detail I provided. When I mentioned the upcoming party for 100 people, he nearly choked on his coffee. "Your Homeowners Association is out of line," he said, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "I want to review your deeds, the HOA's covenants, every official piece of documentation. We'll draft a cease-and-desist letter immediately. And if they ignore it," Mr. Khan's eyes narrowed, "then we file a lawsuit for trespassing, property damage, and violation of property rights. Trust me, these folks are heading straight for a legal meltdown if they keep this up." I felt a wave of relief, but also a pang of stress. Lawsuits are time-consuming, costly, and draining. The neighbors might brand me the villain, the one who wages war against community fun. But in my position, I had to stand firm. There was too much at stake, my personal finances, my sanity, and Ironically, my reputation as a water commissioner, which required me to uphold lawful water usage practices. Speaking of that job, I figured it was time to loop in a few trusted colleagues. One was my deputy, Morris, who had a knack for deciphering convoluted water-related statutes. We scheduled a discreet phone call where I laid out the situation. He let out a low whistle. That's some next-level audacity. Declaring your pool as public water? You could have a field day with them. Wanting to poke around, see if there's any official complaints about water usage from that HOA? That might come in handy, I admitted, but I don't want to escalate prematurely. Right now, I'm hoping the letter from my attorney is enough to scare them off. By midweek, Mr. Khan had a crisp, no-nonsense cease-and-desist drafted. It listed the relevant property codes, the explicit lines from my deed showing the boundaries, and a firm warning that any unauthorized gatherings would result in legal repercussions. I felt a flicker of hope. This had to work. Who in their right mind would keep pushing after being served an official notice? Mrs. Hurst, apparently. When the process server handed her the envelope, she wasted no time calling me. The phone rang at precisely 7 p.m., an hour I suspect she'd chosen to catch me at home. "Angela," she began, voice trembling with what sounded like a mix of anger and indignation. "I just got some outrageous document from so-called attorney claiming we're trespassing. You do realize all you're doing is racking up fines for yourself, correct?" The board decided. This arrangement stands. I felt my jaw tighten. "Did you actually read the letter?" She huffed. "I did. And the board has a different legal interpretation. We have the right to utilize the common space. I suggest you withdraw this threat immediately. Otherwise, I'll see to it that you're penalized for harassment of the HOA. I struggled to keep my composure. "You're the one harassing me, Mrs. Hurst. You're about to break multiple laws by inviting 100 people onto private property for an event I haven't approved. And if you persist, there will be consequences far beyond fines." My tone was measured, but inside, adrenaline roared like a waterfall. "That sounds dangerously close to a threat," she shot back. "It's not a threat. It's a promise," I said, then hung up. I paced my living room for a solid half hour, trying to quell the tension snaking through my body. It was like reasoning with a brick wall that insisted it was a door. My phone lit up with texts from sympathetic neighbors, but none dared stand up to the HOA publicly. Mrs. Hurst had them convinced that she wielded the power to fine them into oblivion or restrict their community privileges. Finally, Saturday morning arrived, the day of the rumored 100-person bash. I woke up to the sound of trucks unloading supplies on the street. The HOA had apparently rented folding tables, chairs, decorations, and large rolling coolers. They were setting up a legitimate festival on my lawn. My chest tightened with anger. I watched from a window as a few neighbors carried in balloons, streamers, and large metal tubs for drinks. A band, an actual live band, began unloading instruments near my fence. This was beyond surreal. It was borderline mania. Around noon, people started arriving in clusters. By 1 p.m., my property was teeming with at least 70 or 80 individuals milling around, waiting for the official start of the festivities. Mrs. Hurst marched around with a bullhorn, directing people to our wonderful pool. She wore a smug grin that set my nerves on edge. Sighing deeply, I clutched my phone. I'd hoped to avoid a scene, but it was time to strike back. I dialed the local police's non-emergency line. A friendly operator listened patiently as I explained the situation. They sent out an officer to assess the trespassing complaint. When he arrived, I greeted him at the curb. He was a young officer, maybe late 20s, and he looked overwhelmed by the sheer mass of people. He asked Mrs. Hurst for her side of the story. She showed him some of her so-called paperwork. After about 10 minutes, he approached me, looking apologetic. "I'm afraid this is more of a civil matter," he said. "They're claiming the HOA has legal rights to the property. Unless we have a clear court order saying otherwise, it's complicated." I showed him the cease-and-desist letter. He read it, frowned, then shrugged. "My superiors want us to stay out of property disputes unless someone's in immediate danger. Sorry, ma'am." He gave a tip of his hat and left, disappearing through the throng of merrymakers. I shut my eyes, frustration threatening to overwhelm me. But I wasn't done. By 2 p.m., 100 people had arrived. The band struck up lively tunes, boisterous laughter echoed across the yard, and children ran around with dripping popsicles. My pool was a chaotic swirl of limbs, floats, and splashes. Someone had set up a tiki bar on my deck of all things. Inside, I braced myself for the final card I'd been reluctant to play. Enough was enough. I opened my laptop and typed out an urgent email to the State Attorney General's office, copying my friend Morris. The subject line was concise, urgent, unlawful misappropriation of private pool as public by local HOA. I attached photos, videos, and copies of the HOA's bogus guidelines. I explained that the property in question belonged to the State Water Commissioner, moi, and that it was being systematically abused under false pretenses. Then I hit send. They wanted a battle? Fine. They had just forced the hand of someone with a thorough knowledge of water law and the backing of state authorities. All that remained was to see which hammer would drop first. The legal one, the regulatory one, or both at once. The weekend party raged on until dusk, culminating in a firework display. Yes, they even brought fireworks. I feared for my roof, my fence, and every living plant on my property. By the time they left, the yard looked like a battlefield. Charred sparkler sticks lay amidst soggy paper plates. My once pristine pool was murky with debris and spilled beverages. Not a single person stayed to help clean up. Even some neighbors who had privately expressed sympathy were too intimidated to defy Mrs. Hurst's instructions to leave it for Angela to handle. By Monday morning, I was ready to tear out my hair. That's when Morris called. "Got some good news," he announced. "The Attorney General's office forwarded your complaint to the State Department that handles HOA oversight. They're taking it seriously. Expect a formal investigation soon." That was music to my ears. I spent the next few days collecting more evidence. Bills for the pool cleaning service, quotes for replanting my damaged flower beds, documentation of water usage spikes. My resentment grew with every item I tallied. Meanwhile, I kept hearing rumors about the next event the HOA planned at my place, a back-to-school splash for the community kids. The nerve of these people, scheduling another invasion before the dust had even settled. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, as I was trying to fish soda cans out of my skimmer basket, a black SUV pulled up in front of my house. Two serious-looking men in suits stepped out, badges clipped to their belts. Turns out they were from the State Department's HOA Regulatory Commission. I let them in, offered them coffee, and explained everything. They nodded calmly, occasionally trading glances. One of them, Mr. Peterson, specialized in property rights issues. The other, Mr. Delgado, handled code enforcement. They asked to see the yard and the pool setup. When we walked outside, they surveyed the leftover wreckage from the weekend party, the scuffed deck, the dislodged fence posts. "And you say they're planning another event?" Mr. Delgado asked, sounding incredulous. "Yes, another big one," I replied, swirling my net in the pool to remove more trash. "I have no intention of letting that happen." Mr. Peterson studied my fence line, the walkway connecting it to the community path. "The HOA claims this path grants them access to your property." "Claims is the right word," I said with a bitter laugh. "They're twisting every line of the bylaws." He exhaled slowly. "We've handled overreaching HOAs before, but this is blatant. I'll be filing an immediate injunction. We'll also investigate possible violations of state water usage regulations, particularly if they've misled the public into believing your private pool is an open resource." Within hours, official letters and emails were zipping through cyberspace. I could barely keep up with the flurry of communications. The next day, a notice was hand-delivered to Mrs. Hurst and the HOA board, informing them of the commission's investigation. They were ordered to cease any activity related to my pool until further notice. Mrs. Hurst called me that night, voice shaking with fury. "You can't do this. This is harassment, Angela. You've turned our happy neighborhood into a legal nightmare. The neighbors are outraged at you." "My name is Commissioner Beaumont," I responded firmly. "And yes, I can do this. You're in violation of multiple codes, and your next step should be to hire a lawyer." She sputtered, caught off guard by my formal tone. "You're some sort of official?" "That's right. State Water Commissioner." It's in my purview to ensure lawful usage of water resources, among other things. Did you think your little power play would go unnoticed?" Silence clung to the line. I could almost feel her shock vibrating through the phone. Then she hung up without another word. Within a week, the Regulatory Commission descended on the HOA. They pored over board meeting minutes, financial records, and every piece of nonsense they distributed about public water rights. Several of the board members resigned under the pressure. Mrs. Hurst, stubborn as ever, tried to cling to her position, but her face was ashen each time she saw me. That same week, Mr. Kahn filed the trespassing and property damage lawsuit. The combination of regulatory and legal action was overwhelming for the HOA. They retracted their bogus claim over my pool in a formal statement, but by then, the damage was done. Fines started piling up for unauthorized gatherings, destruction of private property, and misappropriation of funds. The board's insurance barely covered a fraction of it. And it wasn't just me who was upset. Several neighbors discovered they had also been unfairly fined or bullied by the HOA in the past. A wave of complaints flooded the commission's office. During a heated emergency meeting, Mrs. Hurst attempted to defend her actions. She claimed she believed it was in the community's best interest. But the facts were stacked against her, and the neighbors who once supported her realized they'd been misled. Facing threats of personal liability, she finally stepped down. The new interim board, eager to make amends, immediately sent me an apology letter and a pledge to cover any costs related to pool repairs and landscaping. I was relieved but still cautious. I demanded full reimbursement for every dime I spent cleaning and fixing my yard. The new board agreed. They also voted to install a solid fence along the property line to ensure no further confusion. As for the walkway, they closed it off and posted clear signage that my pool was private property. The lawsuits and investigations wrapped up a few months later. The HOA was mandated to revise its bylaws under direct supervision from state regulators. Mrs. Hurst was barred from holding any official position within the community for a minimum of 5 years. She sold her house soon after, unable to face the neighbors she had manipulated. In the aftermath, I became somewhat of a local legend, the quiet woman who turned out to be the state water commissioner and fought back against an oppressive HOA. Some folks started calling me Kamish, or the water lady, with big grins on their faces. I've lost count of how many neighbors came by to apologize or share their own horror stories about petty fines and bizarre HOA rules. It's funny how quickly reputations shift. Before, I was the odd, somewhat standoffish homeowner who rarely attended block parties. Now, I'm the outspoken champion for property rights and sane water usage. In a strange way, the fiasco brought me closer to the community, albeit in the most unorthodox manner. I still keep an eye on my yard, though. Old habits die hard, and trust me, I won't tolerate trespassers again. When all is said and done, I still love my home. My pool has returned to being a place of relaxation, a quiet, glimmering oasis where peewee can laze by the water, and I can enjoy the gentle hum of cicadas in the evening. No raucous parties, no bullhorns, no frantic trampling through the flower beds. Sometimes, neighbors ask if they can come by for a dip. And you know what? If they ask politely and respect my property, I don't mind one bit. I suppose that's the final irony. I'm not opposed to sharing. I'm opposed to having something stolen from me under the guise of community by people who think they can bulldoze my rights. In the end, justice prevailed. My property boundaries were restored, the HOA was overhauled, and my pool remained undeniably mine. And if anyone doubts that, they know exactly who to call for confirmation: the water commissioner herself. The end.